My name's Nate. I'm a representative from Stanford Government. I am leading the Public Policy Forum Committee along with one of our lovely moderators, Rachel. My committee had this wonderful opportunity to put on this debate along with the Stanford Debate Society, which our other lovely moderators from. And then I'd also like to take the time to thank not only the Stanford Debate Society and all the people in Stanford Government that helped the PPF committee put this on, but also the Stanford Dems for coming here and participating in this debate and proposing their platform. And then also the Stanford College Republicans, SCR, for coming and proposing their platform as well. Should be a very fun time. If you guys are interested in getting involved with any opportunities revolving around Stanford Debate Society, a link will be sent to the RSVP page, the Facebook page that you guys can refer to. If you guys have any questions about Stanford government, feel free to ask me or any of our other people staffing this event from SIG, and we can help you out with that. And then also, please stay with us for a post-debate discussion being moderated from March for Our Lives, and they'll be posing questions to both other groups that are participating as to what their how their plans kind of factor into the overall mission statement for March for Our Lives. So thank you guys for coming so much. And now we'll have one of PPF's lovely CMs, Bill Wormuth, introduce the debate with kind of like a speech on the background of gun policy and the issues surrounding it in this country.
All right. Welcome everyone to our first debate of the year, hosted by Stanford Government and Stanford Debate Society. We are so happy to have you here tonight as we discuss gun policy, a poignant issue so prevalent to college students today. Nearly 40,000 people died last year in the United States alone due to gun violence, the highest number reported in over 50 years. The Stanford Democrats and the Stanford College Republicans join us tonight to discuss how each side of the aisle will manage gun policy in America. What brings us together is a shared interest in the safety of every citizen. Gun deaths ravage communities and tear families apart. We face a critical time in our lives where our generation has stood up and demanded something be done. Each side here tonight will voice their opinions on this ever-growing crisis and address the best way of handling it. Through discourse, hopefully, we can find common ground and work towards creating policies that can save lives across the nation. Let the games begin.
This summer I was driving through Gilroy with my little sister. The Garlic Festival was that day, but we were running late, so we didn't stop by there. Though we drove through the town and passed it, someone else pulled off the highway, and with his Wasser 10, a semi-automatic variant of an AK-47, which he had purchased legally in Nevada, he easily fired 39 rounds into 15 people, killing 3 of them. Thank God my sister and I did not stop there that day, but that does not mean that we are safe. Just 5 days later, a man entered a Walmart in El Paso, carrying the exact same assault weapon, purchased legally in Texas, and shot 46 people, killing 22 of them. Not even 24 hours after that, a man carrying an AR-15 went into a bar in Dayton, Ohio, and shot 36 people in 32 seconds, killing 9, even though police were able to kill him almost immediately. And this doesn't even include the other estimated 566 mass shooting, suicide, and single homicide gun deaths that occurred across those 6 days, which occurred particularly in black and brown communities. Despite, and perhaps because of, the fact that there are so many civilian-owned firearms in the United States, more than the number of people, by the way, we are not safe. This is the status quo that the Republicans are defending. Fortunately, despite what the Republicans say, there are things we can and must do. We need to do everything in our power to prevent unnecessary gun deaths and injuries in this country. We need to change the system that is working so hard to stifle the democratic process and perpetuate this status quo, taking power away from the individuals who are most affected by this issue. Fortunately, the Democratic Party has solutions for this. There are a wide range of policies, but tonight we will discuss 5. 1, implementing a federal ban on assault weapons and high-capacity magazines without the loopholes of the 1994 law. 2, placing limitations on the purchase of rifle ammunition. 3, implementing universal background checks. 4, implementing threat assessment policies like red flag laws. And 5, repealing the Dickey Amendment and funding gun violence prevention research by the CDC. While realistically we can't eradicate the desire to commit murder, we can minimize the number of deaths that occur in one incident of attempted mass murder. It is a fact that some weapons enable users to injure more people in a given amount of time and have those people die, more likely to die from their injuries. Assault weapons are these weapons. We should reinstate an assault weapons ban and high-capacity magazine ban. During the 10-year period that this was in effect, mass shooting fatalities were 70% less likely to occur. And this one would be even more effective because we would be closing the loopholes that were in that one. Most Americans, including half of Republicans, support this. 2, while the assault weapons ban will mostly decrease the number of shots which can be fired in a given amount of time, another aspect that heavily influences the lethality of these weapons is the ammunition used. Bulletproof backpacks and soft armor cannot block certain ammunition. In general, rifle rounds rip through people while handgun rounds stop them more. So at the very least, we need to limit the purchase of these rifle cartridges, which are more legal. We need to stop this problem on the front end, which we can do with universal background checks, which are proven to be effective at reducing homicide, suicide, and domestic violence. States which required them saw 35 fewer gun deaths per capita, 52% fewer mass shooting incidents, 53% fewer firearm suicides, 31% overall fewer suicides per capita. And again, the American public supports this policy. In case someone gets by the background check, we need to have something in place if they're later found to be an extreme risk. And that is where extreme risk protection orders and red flag laws come in. 42% of mass shooters and 80% of suicide victims give off advance warning signs. Obviously, mental health is the primary issue with suicide, and we have policies to address that. But if someone is going to commit suicide, they are less likely to die from it if they're not using a firearm. Lastly, we need to research this issue. If we don't have the information, we can't solve this. The Dickey Amendment currently in place bans any congressional funds from doing this out of fear of financial repercussions. Not surprisingly, the NRA is for this. As a result of this amendment, funding was at $2.6 million. It is now down to $100,000 out of a $5.6 billion budget. We can afford this. We need to do this. And the fact that Republicans are trying to prevent this research from occurring means that they have something to hide, and frankly calls into question how badly they really want to see gun violence decrease. And the beauty is, all of these things that we are proposing are in accordance with the Second Amendment, which we agree is valuable. Even Justice Scalia, who wrote the majority opinion in D.C. v. Heller, has said that there are some limitations which can be imposed based on the context of when the amendment was written. The majority of the Americans support our proposals that we are saying. They know that doing next to nothing, surprise, surprise, isn't going to fix this. And I don't know about you, but if I don't do everything in my power to prevent these deaths, I will feel very guilty. And that is why I'm advocating for these proposals.
On July 4th, 1776, a fledgling nation of colonists declared war on the greatest empire in the history of the human race. After years of fierce fighting and prudent alliance-making, they emerged victorious and brought into this world a government of the people, by the people, and for the people. But it is impossible for us to understand the events of July 4th, 1776 without going back to April 19th, 1775, the spark that lit the powder keg of revolution, and the shot heard around the world. The battles of Lexington and Concord began when British soldiers moved to seize the weapons and munitions of the local militia. Of all the indignities and tyrannies that the British had imposed on the American colonists, this was the one that was not to be borne. Governments committed most of the murders in our history. There are no shortage of examples, but the Nazi Holocaust, the Maoist Great Leap Forward, the Soviet Gulag Archipelago, and countless other examples from the 20th century alone demonstrate what can happen to a disarmed population. In our system of political checks and balances, none is more important than that of a well-armed citizenry. The first gun control laws in the United States knew this. They were targeted at black Americans so that Southern Democrats and the Ku Klux Klan could attack them without fear of reprisals. And if you want an example of black Americans being able to defend themselves, you need to look no further than Condoleezza Rice at Stanford University herself, who recounts tales of her father being able to scare off Klansmen who are coming to her house with a shotgun. On top of that, there's obviously political examples to this day that still occur. I mean, if you doubt that the police can be brutal and that government can crack down on civil liberties, look no further than Hong Kong. Do you think that would be happening right now if the Hong Kongers had any basic right to defend themselves or arms? There are also common criminals and murderers that we have to defend ourselves from as well. When seconds count, the police are only minutes away. Our opponents mentioned the 40,000 people who die every year by gun violence. That number is somewhat misleading, but even that is nothing compared to the 500,000 to 3 million people who use guns defensively in this country every year, as per CDC research that actually does exist. So not shocking. We hold these truths to be self-evident, that all men are created equal, that they are endowed by their natures with certain inalienable rights, and that among those rights are life, liberty, and property. That the ability to defend one's life, one's liberty, and one's property is as crucial a right as any other, and that to surrender it is the action of cowards and fools. Those who would surrender their basic liberty for some temporary security deserve neither, and they will lose both.
This issue is one of the most heated debates in the country, and I'm going to address the other side's point of view for a moment. The main reason for your argument, the reason why you don't want Americans to have access to guns in the manner that they do now, is because you're scared, because you don't feel safe, because you believe there is an inherent danger to a society if people have an unfringed right to bear arms. And to you I say, I understand that. I went to high school the same time as you. I remember seeing the Sandy Hook shootings on TV. I remember having to talk to my little sister about what to do if there was ever an active shooter in our school. And that's scary. It is. But your solution just doesn't make sense. Getting rid of guns in America will not make America a safer place. Ignoring the fact that criminals inherently do not care about the law and will always find ways to get access to guns, whether it's legal to own them or not. Ignoring the fact that most proposed gun control laws wouldn't have stopped the mass shootings that politicians say they're meant to curb. What gun control would truly do is create a constitutional crisis. It would set a precedent that our inalienable rights aren't really inalienable. That we as citizens give the government the authority to say that in the interest of public safety, they can suspend our constitutional rights. Now, I'm sure we disagree on a lot of issues here tonight, but does anyone in this room truly trust the government all of the time? Does no one think that a future president or congressman won't abuse this newfound power to cover up a scandal that would otherwise be reported by the news, citing that it prevents a danger to public safety to publish this? Or possibly that a president will point out that a specific religion is more dangerous and commits more crimes than any other religious group? And despite the fact that we have freedom of religion here in America, the risk to public safety is too high for you to practice your religion here. Personally, I don't trust the government to have free reign over when, how, or if I can practice my inalienable rights. And tonight, if you argue for gun control policies, I want you to ask yourself, would you want to live in a world where these same restrictions are placed on your right to freedom of speech, freedom to worship, to an attorney, to freedom of the press? Because I assure you, if we back down on this, if you're willing to give up just one of our rights, we will one day wake up to a world where we have none of them.
My opponent has made several assertions which frankly don't make any sense. Let me just go through them. That the government commits the biggest murders. I agree, yeah, that is, and we don't want that to happen. That's why we're not proposing to completely disarm people. The things that we're proposing, such as universal background checks, limiting certain types of ammunition, extreme risk protection orders, These are things that will completely not affect you. You will still be able to access the firearms that you need should you be going up against the US government, which, you know, by the way, these are not going to do much against big tanks and stuff, but I do think that you should have something to use against them, so you will keep that. Second, the assertion that gun laws are targeting Black Americans. I understand where this conception comes from. There were a few specific regulations back in the beginning, 200 years ago or so, that were trying to target Black Americans. However, these have little bearing on what we are proposing today. And in fact, Ronald Reagan, a famous Republican figure, during his governorship in California, in response to the Black Panthers, did enact some gun control. But I don't know. I just find that argument very funny coming from your party, given that our party is in favor of so many critical policies that will protect Black Americans. That starts with criminal justice reform, for example. And all of the things that we're proposing will do nothing to restrict Black Americans' rights more than any other person's rights. People who need them, these weapons for self-defense, will still be able to get them. The only difference is that it will decrease the number of guns and the type of guns and lethality of the guns that the people who are trying to get these people are having. I appreciated what you said about being scared. I think that your argument also stems from being scared. You're scared that the government will come down and try to get you, and there are examples of that happening. So it's a rational fear. But it doesn't have to do with the things that we're saying. You would still have access to what you need. You mentioned that gun control wouldn't have stopped the incidences that we're talking about. Actually, all of the incidences that I mentioned in my opening statement would have been stopped, or at least, you know, the damage would have been minimized by our proposals, particularly the assault weapons ban. And you lastly mentioned that this would be restricting a right and that we don't restrict any other rights. There are restrictions on freedom of speech when it infringes upon the rights of other people, and that makes complete sense. And the same thing goes for the Second Amendment. Like I said, Justice Scalia, who wrote the opinion in D.C. v. Heller, said that there are limitations on this, and that doesn't affect that you still have a basic core right to these things. So in conclusion, all of our policies would not do any of the negative things that you're saying. You would be able to keep the same basic functionality that you need.
At this moment, if the people outside would like to kind of squeeze themselves in so they're not completely outside of the room, you guys can try to squeeze in a little bit. And then now we're going to resume debate, so if we could quiet down. Thank you. Rebuttal from
I'd like to begin my rebuttal with a quick story. Unfortunately, one very tragic day, a man, if you can even describe him as that, a better description would have been a monster, decided to walk into a Walmart with an assault weapon, hundreds of rounds of ammo, with the intent to kill as many people as possible. He walked through those doors and killed no one because he was stopped by an off-duty firefighter who had a weapon. The firefighter was able to stop this in Missouri before any lives were lost. And that is the best protection against people who wish to do harm upon you with a weapon, is to have a weapon yourself to defend yourself. Any such infringements on that right will only prevent people like an off-duty firefighter, like a teacher, like an off-duty police officer, like just any civilian from having a gun and being able to defuse a tragic situation like that without any loss of life. Now, in your rebuttal, you mentioned that we have precedent to start restricting rights because in the past, we have restricted rights, for example, on freedom of speech. And I'm afraid in your rebuttal, you actually proved my point there. Because we have this precedent that freedom of speech can be restricted, we can now apply that to other rights. And once we start applying that to other rights, we can apply that to more rights. And if we continue this pattern, we will get to a point where every right is restricted and possibly gone. Now, that's a tragic situation that I don't want to, that's a tragic situation, a tragic dystopia that I don't want to live in. And there are instances where countries have been a lot more restrictive in who has access to weapons, and occasionally it stops mass shooters from being able to commit mass shootings. Instead, for example, in Nice, where they drove a truck into a crowd of people on July 14th, killing 85. Now, I was in France at the time. The next day, I was going to Nice. I never made it there because I no longer felt safe. That is despite the fact that he didn't have access to a gun, and because of the fact that nobody could defend themselves against a man with a truck. These are the realities. If we ban guns from law-abiding citizens are not safe.
As a matter of fact, I myself was in France at the time. I had been in Nice only 5 days. This is not, what? Not the reaction I was expecting, but that's okay. So yes, I also happened to be in France 5 days before. And 85 people were killed, more than any of the examples cited previously. People who want to commit mass murder have many ways of doing it. A truck is not nearly as good of a defensive weapon as it is for an offensive weapon. On top of that, I would like to go back to your contention, the contention of my opponents, about the restriction of rights. The restriction of rights typically is usage against other people, not means. I, as a free citizen, could probably offend a lot more people with a Twitter account than I could just opening my mouth and speaking in public. That being said, just because of the fact that there's a potential for me to harm more people via Twitter and via slander or offensive speech that way does not mean that you can ban me from having a Twitter account. Likewise, it is true that there are certain weapons that are more dangerous than others, but it is the use of our rights against others that is restricted. It is not the possession of those rights in and of themselves. You're not allowed to take away the application of mere equipment. I mean, does the First Amendment not apply to laptops? Does the First Amendment not apply to phones? Does it not apply to certain technology because it didn't exist at the time or because it's too powerful? Where does this stop? And if you're telling me that you're going to take away the strongest weapons we have as civilians and expect us to continue to go against the government, that's ludicrous. So I would seriously recommend you reconsider that.
Thank you. And now we move on to the question portion of our formal debate, in which SDS and Stanford and government will take turns asking questions to SEO or the deaf. So the first question goes out to the Stanford College Republicans. The question is, do you believe that there is a need for stricter background check laws? If so, how do you suggest these laws are reformed? If not, why?
Well, almost every state has very comprehensive background checks. The only exception that exists on U.S. law right now is private sales between individuals. Typically, if I were to sell a gun to somebody I knew, and I'm not in the trade of guns, like let's say I just have an extra, I'm able to sell that to somebody I know, say my brother or a friend, without having to go through a federal background check. That is a bit of a problem. I think that our background check system needs to be more efficient and easier to use. And I think that if we made it more available, I mean, I know there are some steps in Texas that are being taken right now by Governor Greg Abbott to make the background check system more available so that private sellers can also have access to it voluntarily. I think that would probably be better, but at the same time, I think we have reasonably good background checks, at least in terms of permeability. The fact of the matter is, sometimes they're not processing the data properly.
I mean, there's many issues in law enforcement that we have. Take Nicholas Cruz, for example, the Parkland shooter, who was reported to the FBI 53 times, but who was never followed up on, and was able to thus commit the shooting. I think we have a bureaucratic problem in society, and we need to actually use the tools we already have rather than trying to create new ones.
Thank you. And would the Dems like to also rebut to that response?
First of all, universal background checks are proven to prevent violence and save lives by decreasing rates of homicide and suicide. From 2009 to 2012, we saw that states that required background checks on all handgun sales had 35% fewer gun deaths per capita than states with that background check. Without that background check. Furthermore, these states experienced 52% fewer mass shooting incidents, 53% fewer firearm suicides, and 31% fewer overall suicides per capita. When Missouri repealed the background check law, Johns Hopkins researchers determined that this repeal was linked to a 14% increase in Missouri's murder rate. Universal background checks have also proven effective in reducing rates of suicide and homicide in other developed countries such as Switzerland and Finland, both of which implement universal background checks. In 2007, Switzerland ranked third in international gun ownership rates, which has had 24 gun homicides and 250 gun suicides. Similarly, Finland ranked fourth in international gun ownership rates and had only 23 gun homicides and 170 gun suicides. In contrast, the U.S. ranked first in international gun ownership rates, had over 12,000 gun homicides and more than 17,000 gun suicides. Given that countries and states with universal background checks have lower gun homicide and suicide rates, we have to follow suit to save the lives of our citizens.
Thank you.
All right, now a question to the Stanford. What specific policies do you propose for preventing school shootings? How would these policies be implemented?
Our leaders must adopt a multifaceted approach that provides the school community with the tools it needs to intervene and prevent school-based gun violence. Arming teachers is fundamentally ineffective. In a moment of extreme duress, a school teacher can't transform into a specially equipped law enforcement officer. They're more likely to hit a student bystander or be shot by law enforcement. Here are some approaches that are effective. 1. Pass red flag laws. 2. Encourage responsible firearm storage. 3. Raise the age to purchase semi-automatic firearms. 4. Require background checks on all gun sales. 5. Creating threat assessment programs in schools to understand and intervene when the student is a risk to themselves or others. 6. Implementing expert-endorsed school security upgrades that prevent access to schools and classrooms. 7. Initiating effective emergency planning so staff can lock schools and law enforcement officers can initiate quick responses. These are all doable. One of the key policies that we are supporting specifically is the passage of extreme risk protection orders, which we supported in our opening statement, essentially temporarily disarming people who have proven to be a credible or significant threat to themselves or others. We've seen again and again with extreme risk protection orders in California, there were 21 cases where these orders were able to disarm people who threatened mass shootings. One was a car dealership employee who threatened to shoot up his workplace, and the second was actually a high school student who threatened to commit a mass shooting in their own school. In Maryland, we saw 4 individuals disarmed who threatened violence against schools in the first 3 months of the extreme risk protection order. In Florida, we saw 1 person disarmed among many others, but this specific one wrote that, quote, murder would be fun and addicting. And in Vermont, there was a person disarmed by an extreme risk protection order who had kept a journal of an active shooter. Clearly, these policies can and will reduce the risk of threats to our schools. In addition, the 2002 FBI report stated that by far the most valuable prevention strategy identified was the Threat Assessment and Management Team, and a 2018 Department of Homeland Security report stated that preventing violence by detecting and addressing behavioral red flags is more effective than any physical security measure. In addition, reports from federal agencies under the Bush and Trump administrations, including the recent Federal Commission on School Safety, recommended that schools implement school threat assessment programs. Clearly, these have bipartisan support. Our only question is why our opponents can't follow suit.
To answer that question, I'd like to point out the fact that red flag laws are actually doubly unconstitutional. Because not only do they disregard your right
They
to bear
still
arms.
have 40 seconds left.
I thought they'd stopped.
Several studies have found that schools that have used threat assessment programs see as few as 0.5 to 3.5% of students that attempt and carry out their threat of violence, with none of the threats that were carried out being serious threats to kill, shoot, or seriously injure someone. Although our opponents are not necessarily opponents, but Republicans have proposed arming teachers, a March 2018 survey of almost 500 U.S. teachers found that 73% opposed proposals to arm school staff.
Okay, to go back to the previous point, doubly unconstitutional. Because not only does it take away your right to bear arms, but it does so without any due process. Red flag laws, you are assumed guilty until proven innocent. We do have mechanisms in the extreme cases to take rights away from people, and that's called a criminal court. And you know what? Conspiracy to commit murder and assault and threatening are all crimes people can be prosecuted for. But you have to go through the process. You can't accuse somebody and take away their guns or take away their property or take away their liberty without charging them with a crime and without going through the process. I mean, these are American civil liberties that matter, and we're not going to just throw them away for something that is unnecessary because we have totally legitimate legal means to do much the same thing. So,
Beyond that, as solutions to this question, yes, we do propose several measures, first of which being train professional armed security. And as you mentioned, 73, I believe you said, % of teachers don't support being armed. We take the other 27% who are willing to be armed, give them comprehensive psychiatric background checks and training, and then arm them to protect the students that we all believe deserve a right to live.
Thank you. And the third question goes to the Stanford College Republicans. Assault weapons and high-capacity magazines are commonplace in mass shootings. Does the right to bear arms extend to assault rifles? Where do we draw the line in terms of gun ownership?
okay, to answer your question first, an assault weapon and an assault rifle are two technically different terms. An assault rifle is a selective fire military-grade weapon that no civilian has access to in common practice. The AR-15 is a semi-automatic weapon, and it is commonly referred to as an assault weapon, which is a bit ludicrous because all weapons are technically at least possible to be used for assault. That's what makes them weapons. So on top of that, yes, they are very obviously protected by the Second Amendment. I mean, if we look back to historical context, we have letters of marque from President Madison authorizing private citizens to own cannons. So, I mean, the historical arguments say that only muskets were protected is ludicrous. And the fact of the matter is, these citizens were expected to be armed to a sufficient capacity that they could resist the military. So having weapons that were comparable to militaries is actually the entire purpose. So it's the letter and spirit of the Second Amendment, essentially. The right to bear arms shall not be infringed.
And the Dems would like to respond to that.
I heard, I believe, 2 points from you. One, that you do not think assault weapons should be banned because they're protected under the Second Amendment. Perhaps we should clarify what an assault weapons ban would do. An assault weapons ban would mean that you're not allowed to have a semi-automatic firearm with a detachable magazine. That means you can still have semi-automatic firearms, which essentially just means that one trigger pull means one bullet fired. The difference is that it would take you a little bit longer to reload. And combined with the high-capacity magazine ban, that means that you would have to load more frequently as well, because you can't just have 100 rounds in there. And second, you mentioned extending the right to bear arms to things such as cannons and other things that are equivalent to what the military has. But actually, the way Justice Scalia read the Second Amendment, the right to bear arms means that you have to be able to hold it. It has to be handheld, so that doesn't even apply here.
I disagree with the Right Honorable Justice Scalia. So. Strenuously.
Alright, the fourth question goes to the Stanford Democrats. Of the nearly 1,500 weapons that the Bureau of Alcohol, Tobacco, and Firearms checked from 2016 through 2018 in Jamaica, 71% came from the US illegally. To what extent do you think a black market or smuggling of firearms will negate the gun control measures many Democrats have recently advocated for? How would you seek to address the illegal trade of firearms?
So the majority of guns that are used to commit homicides, mass homicides and otherwise, and suicides are obtained legally. So therefore, by concentrating on the largest share of gun deaths, we're doing far more than the Republicans. As for the actual black market and smuggling portion, we'll put more resources into our law enforcement agencies and buttress current disincentives against stepping outside of the system with licensing programs and background check requirements that place liability on private sellers who fail to go through a correct process to sell guns. Applying the logic of our opponents that terrorists and criminals aren't deterred by laws, why have any laws? If criminals are just going to run red lights, why have traffic penalties? The NRA's reasoning is just a prescription for chaos, and it does not withstand contact with empirical reality. Laws do influence criminal behavior. In the aftermath of the 1995 Oklahoma City bombing, we saw that federal legislation made it more difficult for consumers to obtain bomb-making ingredients and easier for law enforcement to monitor purchases. That new oversight led terrorists to revamp their tactics. Bombs were used significantly less. In addition, we've seen that guns are significantly more lethal than any other tool that is easily accessible on the market. We see that they're less regulated than toy guns, and as a result, there's no way that common sense gun legislation will not significantly reduce death and injury to American lives. On December 14th, 2012, a man wielding a knife assaulted people at a school in Champaign, China, stabbing 23 children and 1 adult. Hours later, a man armed with an AR-15 attacked an elementary school in Newton, Connecticut, shooting 20 students and 8 adults. At Sandy Hook, all 20 children and 6 of the 8 adults died. In China, there was not a single fatality. The guns made all the difference.
Would Stanford College Republicans like to respond?
We actually have a few responses to that. I'll try to fit into the time. Starting with, how many people in this room are under the age of 21? Okay, I won't make you raise your hands for this next part, but how many of you have had any alcohol in the last week? The simple fact of the matter is, making something illegal doesn't make it impossible for someone to get. Now, you might say, it's very easy to get alcohol in the United States. Anybody over 21 can buy it legally. Let's look at prohibition. When we banned alcohol in the United States, alcohol didn't disappear. Alcohol got more dangerous, and organized crime rates went up. That's what will happen if we make guns illegal to buy. Any caliber of guns illegal to buy. What will happen is criminals who have means will get those guns. Law-abiding citizens will not. And in fact, states that have some of the best ratings, according to Giffords Law Center, in terms of common sense gun legislation, it doesn't often work. For example, Baltimore, Maryland, in the state of Maryland, which has an A- rating, is the 4th highest rate of gun deaths in the country. Oakland, with a state rating of A, is 5th highest. Buffalo, with a state rating of A- is 12th highest.
Thank you. Moving on to the next question, posed to SCR. What policies does your group propose as a means of keeping guns out of the hands of people deemed unfit for gun ownership? For example, people with criminal history, domestic violence records, mentally unstable patients, children, etc.
We would propose going for the courts. As we said earlier, there are precedents for taking away liberties from certain individuals, like the right to vote, for instance. If you're committed as a serious felon in many states, after you leave prison, you're no longer allowed to have the right to vote. Sometimes the right to bear arms. There are limitations on your right to freedom of speech. And that can only happen if you've been convicted in a court of law by a jury by your peers. If you are adjudicated mentally unfit by a judge, if you are adjudicated as a criminal by a judge, if you're adjudicated as guilty of domestic violence by a judge, then we are perfectly comfortable with you losing those rights just as you would lose the right to walk freely in society. But in any case other than that, any case outside of the judicial system where all American rights are fully respected, we do not recognize the legitimacy of taking away people's rights.
I see the logic to that, but what you're proposing feels like what we're already doing, if I'm not wrong. And last time I checked, what we're currently doing isn't working. So I actually didn't hear an answer to that question of what we would propose to decrease these things. Also, I just believe that would be too late in the process, and you would be sacrificing many, many lives in doing it this way, which actually is what's happening.
Again, you said that you supported if someone's adjudicated mentally, like unable to own a gun, or if they're convicted of domestic abuse and they're unable to gun, that those are the loopholes that we're trying to close with universal background checks. That's precisely the legislation that we proposed, is that people who are at a significant and credible risk to themselves and others not be able to have access to extremely lethal weapons.
That's already the law in many places, and if the courts adjudicate you unfit for that right, then that is their power in the country. So
we propose closing the loopholes, which imply that there's already holes in the existing law. So your point that that's already the law doesn't stand.
We would appreciate if the debate format could follow what has been previously agreed upon. And now the next question will go to the Stanford Democrats.
Communities of color and low socioeconomic status are disproportionately affected by crime and violence. For example, Black Americans are 10 times more likely than white Americans to die by gun homicide. How can future public policies address both the need for gun violence reduction and self-defense in these communities?
So, responding to the point of self-defense, there are actually fewer than 1,600 verifiable instances annually where individuals use a gun to defend themselves, out of that 118 people shot each year, and that's according to the Gun Violence Archive. A 2015 study of FBI and national crime concluded that people are more likely to cause an accidental death than prevent a crime from pulling a gun in self-defense. The Washington Post reports that for every justifiable homicide using a gun, there are 34 criminal suicides, 78 gun suicides, and 2 accidental deaths. So we fundamentally disagree with the contention that guns are a weapon of self-defense, because as we've seen through data and proven repeatedly, it's difficult to verify whether people actually frequently use a gun to defend themselves. We do, with regard to the point about communities of color and of lower economic status, lower socioeconomic status. We support comprehensive federal and state level policies to reverse sort of the centuries-long impact of systematic and structural racism. This includes a massive overhaul of the criminal justice system, reparations for the sons of enslaved people. But the way to prevent disproportionate harm to marginalized communities is not refusing to enact restrictions on gun ownership.
One more thing to add is that I actually wrote a research paper about this, and one of the most important things, in addition to these measures, is including the people who are in these communities in the process of finding the solution. This means people of color and disabled people largely. And the Democratic Party has a history of doing this. Members of those communities support the Democratic platform, and so they don't support Republicans as much and your platform, and I think perhaps you would benefit from involving these people more in your process.
Would the Stanford College Republicans like to respond?
We would. Dealing specifically with the low-income communities and communities of color, a lot of the gun violence that unfortunately plagues these communities is with gang violence regarding illegally purchased guns. And one of the greatest ways to reduce gun violence in those communities is to scale back and even end the drug war. Because the more power we give to the cartel, the more money they have when they sell their wares, the more weapons that they can purchase illegally without any background checks, because they will never face a background check no matter how strict we make the system. The cartel will definitely find a way around it. And even if we do start reducing the amount of guns in these communities, if we suspect that X, Y, and Z citizens have guns, do we support measures to forcefully take those guns away? Do we want police going door to door in communities of color under the suspicion that there may be a gun in that house? Because that is certainly nothing that I want in any community, certainly not one low income or of color.
If I may also, 16,000 is ridiculously low. The CDC had 500,000 to 3 million, so.
It was actually 1,600, not 16,000.
1,600, oh, that's worse.
All right, thank you. So the next question is to SCR. The U.S. accounts for just 4% of the world's population, but 35% of global firearm suicides. What specific policies do you propose for preventing firearm suicides?
Well, that statistic is a tragedy. Every loss of life is a tragedy. However, the statistic's a touch misleading. Obviously, the U.S. has the most access to weapons, and so there will be the largest rates of gun suicide. That's the same as in every community that has electricity running through their housing, there's going to be more electrical fires. That doesn't mean there's less fires, that doesn't mean there's less accidents, that means that there's more accidents involving those. If we look at actual suicide rates, Japan, for example, has some of the strictest gun laws in the world, and their suicide rate dwarfs ours. This is true for a number of other countries, for example, Belgium. So it's a tragedy that people are taking their own life, but they're taking their own life with a gun because it's there. If it wasn't there, it would be a razor blade, it would be a rope, it would be any other thing. And addressing the gun as the problem isn't the problem. It's trying to create a society where people don't feel like suicide, at any means, is the answer.
Do you have a fact check?
Hello. The statistic about 1,600 defensive gun uses was disputed. Compiled evidence suggests that the Gun Violence Archive, where that statistic is sourced from, does indeed say that there are fewer than 1,600 defensive gun uses every year. This statistic is widely disputed and largely depends on methodology. Other accounts claim that there is anywhere between 55,000 to 85,000 defensive gun uses per year from a study done by Harvard University researchers. The Violence Policy Center compiles 5 years of FBI statistics between 2007 and 2001 and says that there is an average of 67,740 defensive gun uses per year.
Thank you. Still have 3 minutes left to answer your question about preventing firearm suicide.
I believe the biggest thing that we can do is not make it harder for people to commit suicide with guns, but make it less of a solution to commit suicide in general. Because I feel like taking away guns won't lower suicide rates, it'll just lower gun suicide rates.
Right. And obviously what matters most is that people are killing themselves. On top of that, there are certain limits to what government can even do in this situation, partially because government's legitimate mandate is defending you from outward aggression. The government isn't supposed to protect you against yourself. But furthermore, I think that as a society, we do need to make changes independent of government because government is not an efficient tool for this. Why are people killing themselves? How are communities failing them? That's something that we have to address as individuals and as groups. It's not something that the government can do. The government can't make your life worth living for you.
Would the Democrats like to respond to that?
It's interesting that you brought up those questions because your stance prevents CDC research and prevents earmarking funds for CD research that will address the answers to those questions. Given that the question was specifically about dealing with firearm suicides as well, the fact that you said it'll just lower gun suicide rates actually says that common sense gun legislation will reduce firearm suicides. The question was not about solving suicides in general, but instead about reducing firearm suicides. CDC research can address things like how is gun violence prevention different than other kinds of gun violence prevention? Will it be effective in preventing suicides? These are things that we can do if we're able to research. Furthermore, our group has proposed significant policies, including extreme risk protection orders, that will be crucial to suicide prevention since people often exhibit red flags before taking their own life. According to Giffords, warning signs can be detected in advance from about 80% of people who are contemplating suicide, and as a result, our policies will be effective in preventing firearm suicide specifically.
All right, this next question goes to the Stanford Democrats. Recently, Dick's Sporting Goods destroyed $5 million worth of their inventory of military-style firearms, and Walmart came out against open carry in their stores. What role or responsibility do you think businesses should have, if any, in the prevention of gun violence?
The first thing that we want to say is that we do support those measures. We think that it's really good. I believe Walmart's decision happened after so many people were killed in its store. There are many other companies, including LL Bean, Facebook, Citibank, and PayPal, which have also enacted measures to prevent gun violence. I know it's a significant part of the Republican platform to leave it up to private businesses and individuals to handle situations. We agree that there's definitely a significant role for those people in this issue, and we do want them to take as much action as they can, which we believe these measures are doing. We think that major gun retailers, which include Dick's and Walmart, have a responsibility to enact policies that ensure that their stores are enforcing gun laws, particularly around background checks, age minimums, and similar policies. And this comes into place if the Republicans keep blocking all of these measures that the government is trying to put in to save people's lives, then it will come down to these people. So we are fully in support of that.
We also want to make sure that the marketing of the businesses that are selling guns and the companies that are producing guns remains true to democratic values and the values of reducing gun violence in this nation. One example is at Sandy Hook Elementary School in 2012, Adam Lanza used a semi-automatic Bushmaster rifle. It was advertised under the slogan, quote, "Consider your man card reissued," to kill 26, including 20 children. We've seen again and again that the gun industry has perpetuated these toxic advertising cycles in which guns are actually promoted as a weapon of toxic masculinity, as a weapon of violence, not as a weapon to defend themselves, as our opponents claim. And furthermore, we wanted to say that the private sales marketplace, as my opponent mentioned, needs to sort of reform itself and needs to make sure that there are significant enforcements of whether or not they're actually complying with universal background checks, because we've seen through the 72-hour loophole, through the boyfriend loophole, through the private sales loophole, that the unlicensed sale marketplace is large. So that means that the businesses that actually are in the business of legal gun sales and of gun sales that are submitted to the National Instant Criminal Background Check System comply with those regulations.
Furthermore, adding on to the marketing aspect, J&J was recently fined significantly for their contribution in marketing to the opioid crisis. The same exact principle should apply here.
All right. Well, absolutely would. So, Walmart's ban also came after the aborted shooting in Missouri, where a obviously toxic masculine man with a gun was able to prevent a shooting. So, obviously having people carry guns in Walmart can have some benefits. On top of that, though, we as Republicans and as Americans believe firmly in the right of every individual to exercise their own liberties and conduct their own business according to the edicts of their own conscience. As it turns out, Walmart and Dick's made the wrong choice, and I hope the market punishes them severely, because they in fact are selling to gun owners. So this is sort of ludicrous if you're going to insult us. But beyond that, look at it this way. Are we really comfortable with private companies like Facebook or Dick's or Walmart unilaterally deciding when we can exercise our constitutional rights? They have the right to control their own platforms and their own businesses, but there's something a bit unseemly and un-American about taking away your legal rights. So, I suppose that's essentially it.
Thank you. So that concludes the formal Q&A led by SIG and SDS, and now we're going to have closing statements from both parties. Would the Democrats like to give their closing statement?
How many minutes?
Over the course of this debate, our opponents have consistently negated effective solutions to reduce the nationwide epidemic of gun violence in this country, and instead have opposed every plausible proposal for common sense gun legislation. We've seen again and again their talking points refuted. They mentioned that guns are used for self-defense, that they can protect people. However, we've seen that, especially with regards to women and domestic violence victims, 56% of female gun owners believing that owning a gun makes them feel safe, whereas available research, by contrast, suggests that when a woman owns a gun, she actually increases the chances that she'll die. Also, a frequently cited study that states that women frequently have to use guns to protect themselves relies on heavily inflated numbers of instances. One landmark study out of California analyzed 6 years of data from 1991 to 1996 and concluded that women who owned a gun died by firearm homicide at twice the rates of women who didn't. In the same study, the authors found that female gun owners were 15 times as likely to die of firearm suicide as women without guns, and that's only in the example of specifically domestic violence. Our opponents also brought up the point that criminals already don't follow background checks, so it doesn't matter if we implement them. However, as we said, the logic of this argument is fundamentally flawed. That can be used to dismiss the utility of virtually any law because criminals will disobey it. The illogical exemption of private gun sales from background checks is the very reason criminals currently don't have to obey existing background check laws. In addition, although our opponents continually perpetuated the idea that criminals get guns from illegal means in the black market, many criminals get guns from private sellers. Surveys of state prison inmates in 13 states who were convicted of gun offenses found that only 13% obtained the gun from a gun store or pawn shop where background checks are required. 96% of those inmates who were already prohibited from possessing a gun at the time of their crime obtained the firearm through an unlicensed private seller. Research has shown that state universal background checks, along with other state laws designed to increase gun seller and purchaser accountability, significantly reduce the number of guns diverted to the illegal market, where the above high-risk groups often get their guns. Additionally, our opponents mentioned that places that have with strict gun laws have rampant gun violence. However, we've seen that that's because of cross-border and cross-state gun flows. Proximity to places with loose gun restrictions is a predictor of increased gun violence, according to Brian Knight, a Brown University economics professor. So the states that actually do have strict gun legislation, in effect, will still be negatively impacted by the states that don't, which is why we're proposing a national policy. The problem of cross-border gun flows effectively demonstrates the importance of common sense, federal-level gun control, which is what we're arguing. Again, our opponents have only managed to negate our arguments as opposed to propose any of their own. In fact, when we brought up the question of how do we mitigate the epidemic of firearm suicides, they said that common sense gun legislation will only serve to reduce suicide by gun, which was exactly the question that we were trying to solve. Also, our opponents brought up the, quote, racist origins of gun control. However, we countered that effectively by saying that that argument cherry-picks a few specific regulations from a vast sea of gun control laws throughout our past 200 years of American history, and it has little bearing on our modern-day gun violence prevention policy proposals, which are aimed at reducing the epidemic of gun violence throughout the country in communities, specifically low-income communities and communities of color who experience higher rates of violent gun crime. Again, our opponents brought up several questions about, that we don't necessarily know what happens with gun violence, that, we don't know whether these guns are going to be funneled into the black market or illegal means, which is why our proposal, number 5, was to effectively fund and earmark funds for CDC research that can answer these questions. Because without research and with the Dickey Amendment blocking our access to answer any questions about gun violence in this country, we're unable to implement solutions that effectively sort of fix every loophole in the legislation. But again, our main goal remains creating a net that can mitigate the overall epidemic of gun violence. And if we don't sort of start somewhere, if we don't implement policies that are proven with statistics to reduce unnecessary injury and death, then we're not doing anything to solve the problem. You can't hide behind the pretext of patriotic speech to antagonize laws that effectively solve this problem.
Thank you. And now closing from SCR.
So there's a number of points you brought up, both throughout the course of this debate and right here in your closing statement. One of the ones which I wasn't able to respond to was when we talked about what James Madison thought was appropriate for citizens to wield in terms of firearms, and you countered with Scalia's interpretation of the right to bear arms supersedes his. Not usually do I like to paraphrase Bernie Sanders, but I would like to point out that James Madison wrote the Constitution. So I think if anybody knows it, he knows it a little bit better. Then, one thing that I do believe you mischaracterized was our position on gun suicides. I pointed out that getting rid of guns would lower gun suicide rates, yes, in the same way that getting rid of electricity would decrease electrical fires. People would tragically still kill themselves. It would be in the same way as in Japan or in Belgium, just through different means. In fact, if we look at countries that have enacted buyback programs, namely Australia, who enacted a buyback program in 1996, since then, assault rates went up. Robbery spiked immediately after the 96 buyback because people knew that people were not able to defend themselves anymore. And homicide rates were at their highest since 1989 in the year 2002, far after the buyback. Now, you have to ask yourself, do you want to lower the amount of people who are killed by guns, or is it more important to lower the people who are murdered? Because sure, we can get rid of guns, nobody dies by guns anymore. But if more people are dying regardless, that's not a solution. So when we say that we're shooting down your solutions and not proposing any of our own, it's because your solution is not a solution. Our solutions is have more armed citizens, have citizens who have better understanding on how to use a gun, to defend themselves. Because looking at the statistics, there was a bunch of numbers thrown out here. Let's say, I believe the Harvard one was approximately 62,000 people. So let's say 62,000 times a year Americans use a gun to defend themselves. Let's say even 10% of those were life and death. That's 6,000 people. If we get rid of those guns, they no longer can defend themselves. 6,000 people die. If it's even 1%, that's 600 people. I'm not okay with condemning 600 people to death on the idea that it will make a safer society when the statistics from a country who has tried it simply shows it is not true. And, as you mentioned, there's the loopholes of these states with great gun laws, funnel guns in illegally from states with less great gun laws. That's also the case with Mexico, except it's not state to state. It's Honduras funneling guns into Mexico illegally. Now, if we enact all these gun laws, we can't police Honduras, we can't police Mexico, we can't police any other any other countries who are going to smuggle guns into our country illegally. It's just going to make it impossible for law-abiding citizens to get the means to defend themselves and make it all too easy for criminals to do so. Michael?
Over the course of this debate, I have explained why I believe that the measures proposed by our opponents are idiotic, immoral, and positively counterproductive. Perhaps you don't share my convictions, but I would like to take a moment to explain to you why you should not support gun control by your own logic. If you are a feminist in the crowd, do you really want to take away the right of a woman to defend herself in a dark alley against somebody who is much bigger and stronger than she is? If you are a supporter of racial minorities, do you want to give the police the that's what the laughter. Right. Do you want to give the police monopoly on the use of force? Do you want to give them the exclusive access to guns? If you believe that our government is corrupt and has supported things like slavery and genocide and oppression and the rounding up of racial minorities like the Japanese, do you want them to be the only ones with guns? I rest my case. That makes no sense. Thank you.
Alright, so that closes the formal debate portion. And now we're going to have a more informal audience Q&A. But first with March for Our Lives coming up here to introduce themselves and asking a couple questions. So if we could have the March for Our Lives representative.
What's up?
Hi guys, I'm Anna. I'm Olivia. We are both board members at March for Our Lives, which is an organization here on campus that is nonpartisan, that protests and fights for common sense gun legislation and gun reform to keep people safe. So after this, if you are interested in joining March for Our Lives, or if you're interested in registering to vote, there's people right outside this room that can help you with either. Cool. So we have I don't know where to go. It's up here, I guess. We have a few questions that we're gonna ask, and then we're gonna keep it short because the formal debate went long. But our first question, we'll start with the Dems' response, is what do you think is the biggest misconception those on the other side have about your party's positions on this topic?
I would say the largest misconception that jumps out is that we're going to take your guns. None of the measures I proposed would do that. They would just limit things in ways that are most efficiently going to save lives without limiting the functionality that one would need from a firearm for purposes such as defending themselves.
I would say the other big misconception is the good guy with a gun argument, that somehow common sense gun legislation will reduce the amount of people who are able to defend themselves with guns. First of all, as our opponent said, guns will remain in the hands of people who have proved to not be a danger to themselves or society, who aren't adjudicated to be mentally ill or convicted felons. But also, overwhelming empirical evidence supports the fact that the good guy with a gun argument doesn't quite hold up. Of the 160 active shooting incidents that the FBI identified from 2000 to 2013, only 1 was stopped by an armed civilian. In comparison, 2 were stopped by off-duty police, 4 by armed guards, and 21 by armed civilians, as we said. So, I would say that would be the biggest misconception on the other side.
SCR, same question.
Michael, would you like to take this one?
Sure. I think the biggest misconception is that you guys have characterized us as not caring about gun deaths. We do care about gun deaths. We care about the lives of our citizens. We care about the rights of life, liberty, and property for all of our citizens. We want to find ways to defend everyone so that they can live in this country peacefully. We just don't think that guns are the problem. Guns are in fact the solution. The ability of people to defend themselves is a solution. And as we've shown, I think there seems to be a discrepancy in data. We just have wildly different sources, and I don't think that yours are accurate. So, beyond that, I would just point out, again, that some of the highest rates of death are in the areas with the highest gun control. And if you think that smuggling is going to just tear that apart, and that's your argument, that's going to happen regardless of what the gun law is. There are 300 million guns in this country. Almost none of them are registered. Good luck trying to keep track of all of them.
And then talking about that FBI crime statistic, if even one mass shooting was stopped by an armed civilian, that's enough. Stopping, if it was 20 people who were going to die, 3 people who were going to die, 100 people who were going to die, the possibility that that can be stopped, that's what we're defending. The right to defend ourselves and others. And if we have more armed civilians who are trained to use guns properly, that number will go up. If we start making it harder for harder for civilians to gain access to weapons, to be trained in those weapons, and to defend themselves and others, that one mass shooting will disappear. Mass shootings won't go down. Violence won't go down. Robberies won't go down. Crime will continue. And we lose that one in a sea of violence.
Thank you. Okay, well, we're going to ask one more question, and then we're going to open it up to the audience. Do you disagree with any actions or lack thereof leaders of your party have taken on this issue? We'll start with the Republicans this time.
Absolutely. We are very concerned by the move of some people in the Republican Party to move towards red flag laws, which, as I outlined earlier, are unconstitutional both on the Second Amendment grounds of interfering with the right to bear arms and also with the 5th and 14th Amendments guaranteeing rights to due process. So we are very much opposed to that. We think it is foolhardy and unconstitutional.
So we don't disagree with any of the leaders of the Democratic Party on their stance on common sense gun control legislation. We've seen again and again that the Democratic Party is willing to propose active solutions to this epidemic of gun violence, whereas the Republican Party has fought to maintain the status quo that we've proved again and again to be extremely detrimental to not only our democratic values, but to the average American citizen. We defend the use of extreme risk protection orders. Again, we mentioned repeatedly the instances in California, and Florida, and Vermont, and Maryland in which extreme risk protection orders, the red flag laws that you were talking about, have been consistently able to prevent active shooting incidents in their communities. So we stand by all of the policies proposed, and all the policies that we propose as part of our platform align with the general platform of the Democratic Party.
I would add that I respect all the Democratic politicians because they are actually trying to find something to do about this. There are many different solutions that they're coming up with, but they're getting creative with it. They're trying different things. They want to solve this, and they're demonstrating that they want to solve this by actually taking action and proposing real solutions instead of being okay with how things are right now.
I mean, I come from a state that's led by a Republican governor. I come from Maryland, and my fellow gun control activists from Great Mills High School, which was a high school affected by an active shooting last year. One student died, his name is Jalen Wiley. They've tried again and again to get in touch with Governor Larry Hogan, a Republican governor, and see if they can sit down and talk about a solution to this problem. They're not trying to lobby him, they're just trying to sit down and talk about what happened to their school, how they can improve safety in their school. And the response has been, again and again, being declined by his office. He hasn't met with the community that was affected by this shooting once. And I see that extremely often from Republican lawmakers, that they refuse to do anything beyond send thoughts and prayers to the communities affected, and they don't even do the bare minimum, which is sitting down and talking about it.
And then does anybody from the audience want to ask either one side specifically a question or both sides?
Yeah, so just before I ask my question, I just want to say I'm kind of disturbed that you started your conversation with pretty much saying that the Holocaust was the result of the Jews in Germany not being armed. That seemed to be what you were suggesting. I'd love for you to take a chance to maybe reconsider that. Second of all, your argument that I agree, we should be focused on reducing murders in general. All of those countries you listed as having strict gun control laws have significantly lower homicide rates than the United States. There is strong correlation that high gun ownership rates correlate with high murder rates in countries. How do you respond to that?
Okay, well, first off, I think the Holocaust was a product of a number of factors. My only contention was that the Jews would have been in a better position to defend themselves had they been armed. And as a matter of fact, there were certain laws passed by Nazi Germany that actually barred them from use of defensive weapons. So that was my sole contention there. Obviously, there are many mass murders throughout human history, and they have multiple motivations, some of which is just the darkness in the human heart. So that's something that we have to take into account. On top of that, though, there's also competing data within the United States. Take, for example, Texas and Illinois, two states with very large populations and very different gun laws. According to Gifford's Law Center, as cited by our opponents, the Texas state laws for gun control get an F, and the Illinois state gun laws get a B+. However, the gun homicide rate in Texas is 12.4, and the Illinois rate is 12.1 per 100,000, as mentioned by Tristan. On top of that, the rate of gun ownership in Illinois is 26.2%, according to CBS, and in Texas it's 45.7%. So even though there's a quarter difference of the number of people, or the proportion of people with guns in those states, there is almost no difference in the gun homicide rate. So I think the correlation is not as strong as you're making out to be. I would say it's somewhat fallacious, as a matter of fact. Considering as well the fact that if we look at Australia, for instance, the gun homicide rate was decreasing at an identical rate before and after the gun buyback. And the United States, despite having high amounts of gun ownership, has, for the past 25 years, seen considerably lower and lower crime rates in general. We've been decreasing at a pretty steady rate. So.
And then I do wish to elaborate a bit more on the connection that was made between guns and the Holocaust, because the Holocaust is obviously one of the greatest tragedies in human history, and belittling it in any way, shape, or form is awful. Our point is, the right to bear arms is a basic human right as proposed by the US Constitution, which we're in America right now, so that's the idea of human rights that we're working with. Once we start being able to make those human rights arbitrary, it becomes a constant flow of we strip a little bit more, a little bit more, a little bit more, until we can eventually say this group of people are no longer people, they are not guaranteed the same rights that a normal human is, and that is the connection that Michael was trying to make there, that if we allow for us to say these rights no longer apply to you, that is the end result. We're not trying to diminish the Holocaust by any way, shape, or form. Like I've said, that was one of the greatest tragedies in human history. We just never want to see it again.
Another one?
Kind of adding on to that, I was wondering how, like, understanding your argument of it being on the basis of rights, right? Can you please address like the specific measures that the Democratic side is taking? What in your argument holds up against the specific measures? Maybe trying to rephrase on the spot. Your argument about rights, applying to the general case of the Second Amendment, how does that apply to the specific measures the Democratic side is taking in regards to the points they've had? Just as an open question.
All right, so first off, red flag laws are very obviously the easiest case because they violate both the Fifth Amendment and the Second Amendment. Because they're taking away your guns without having any court process. You can just be declared as somebody who needs some sort of rapid response. And you can have your personal property, your weapons seized. And then you're innocent, you are guilty until you are proven innocent. You have to go to court and defend your rights. And that's not something we do for anything else in the United States, with the exception of civil asset forfeiture, which is another major problem. The fact of the matter is you are innocent until proven guilty in this country, and you have a right to bear arms. On top of that, restricting what types of weapons people can buy are also obviously restricting the right to bear arms.
Just to clarify on that, extreme risk protection orders, you define them as being without any court process, whereas the very definition of those laws includes a court process. The purpose of an IRPA law is to allow family members to petition courts to temporarily disarm, or family members or friends to temporarily disarm an individual who poses a significant or credible threat of gun violence. It then has to go through the court, and then their gun is temporarily taken away for a certain period so that they can't pose a risk to themselves or others. It's not taken away permanently, and there are courts involved. And there's no assumption of guilt. It's more about enabling family members and friends to protect individuals from either killing themselves or killing other people with a particularly lethal weapon.
All right, if I may have a rebuttal to that rebuttal. Does it go through a trial? Do you go through a trial by jury of your peers?
We're not going to do rebuttals on this just so we can get to more questions.
Also, that could be answered by a simple Google search.
Okay. And do we have any questions for the Democrat side?
Yeah, so just with regards to legislative incrementalism, like, by passing these common sense gun laws, do we inhibit our ability to pass future, more sweeping, perhaps necessary gun reform?
My opinion on that would be no. But my core belief about this is that what we're doing isn't working. We need to do something. You've seen how much resistance there's been to the very effective measures that we're proposing. We think that this is going to be a journey, but we need to do something, and we believe that these are the measures that are going to be the most effective for how likely they are to be passed through, to at least do something as soon as we can, and then we can see how these work, and we can get the data, and we can make an informed decision about if we want to add anything else on. But yeah, I believe that these are good things to try right now. Yeah.
Hi, this one's for SDR. You mentioned earlier that one of the best reasons for strong gun right in America is self-defense in the face of oppressive forces. Specifically citing that without strong gun ownership in America, government tyranny and police brutality can be much worse. My question is, in what police confrontation ever has the presence of a firearm been beneficial to a black man or a minority?
If I may, let's look at that in a future perspective. Let's say that it's now illegal to own guns, or very, very difficult to own guns, or specific guns aren't allowed. There's been a lot of shootings where a police officer has miscalculated, has overreacted. Now let's say that there is a black citizen who has a gun, and now guns are suddenly illegal, or he believes it's a specific type of gun that's illegal, or a specific modification of a gun that's illegal. We now make it easier for police to overreact. We make it easier for them to make a snap judgment call that will end in a fatality. We make it easier for people who are doing nothing wrong to die at the hands of the government.
But in any situation, how would a black man or a minority man or a minority anyone having a gun when confronting the police ever be beneficial to them?
Well, I mean, if they can demonstrate that they have the right to self-defense and that the police were aggressing upon them and acting improperly, then that would be adjudicated in the courts, and presumably they would be able to defend themselves in courts on that basis, just like every other American.
Aren't police allowed to fire on people who have weapons and if they feel threatened?
Under many circumstances, yes, but if that's not justified, then no.
Okay, we're gonna stop this question. Does anyone have, final question, because we wanna be respectful of your time. Does anyone have a question that both sides could answer?
Oh, yeah, I actually do.
Okay, Catherine, final question.
Hi, final question. Wow, a lot of pressure. So my question is more of a philosophical question, I guess, about democracy. And I don't know the right answer to it either. So one of the great points the Dems consistently brought up was that the majority of the American public supports stricter gun laws in one way, shape, or form. Even a lot of Republicans support stricter gun laws as well. And a lot of your points tonight were about if we take away rights here, where does it stop? What other rights can we take away? So I guess kind of my question on the other side of that is, if you propose we stop listening to the American public here, we ignore the majority, we ignore what, America wants to vote for, where do we stop? Like, how do you justify, and, Dems too, where are the issues that you feel like is the American public uneducated? Do we not listen to them? And, if your line is drawn at guns, where else, I guess?
That's actually a very good question, and actually, you're right, it's very philosophical, and it gets down right to the root of what the founders were struggling with when they created this nation, and that's why they decided on a republic, a representative republic, and the very specific reason for that is this idea of tyranny of the majority, and James Madison specifically, but all the founding fathers were very hesitant that a large group of people will, specifically a majority, will vote that we want this or we want to change this at the expense of a smaller group, even if what they want, even if more people want it, isn't necessarily what's best for the country. And that's why we have these representatives who vote in a specific way, and that's why even though a majority of Americans might think this one way, that doesn't necessarily pass, and this is the case with many things besides gun laws. And I feel like just because most people support it and most people think it, doesn't necessarily mean that something's always right. For example, in Nazi Germany, once again, the majority believed that what was being done was okay. This can be said in ancient Rome. The majority of people believed that watching people fight to the death in a coliseum was okay. And so, yes, a majority of people might think it, but that doesn't necessarily mean that it's right.
So what does mean something's right?
I think that's why we elect our representatives, and eventually you have to elect representatives who will be able to think carefully on these decisions and weigh in. You're supposed to elect people who are the best for leading the country. There's definitely debate to be made on both sides of that is, and that's
if our legislature was this intelligent vanguard. But look at our executive branch right now. Look at our administration. Like, we can clearly see that has failed. That our administration, even like the presidency, is I don't know if you would refer to him as like an intelligent vanguardist, but that's.
And I believe that comes down to the responsibility of American citizens there, and that's how they directly impact it, is either choosing representatives that represent their beliefs better or who are more intelligent or who understand the issues better, or activists like who believe a certain way, finally throwing their hat into the fray and saying, I'm going to run for this, these are what I believe in, and if they get elected and they can change the system within the framework of the Constitution, that's
fine. If I may also weigh in.
I would just add that people throwing their hats into the race and, joining the House of Representatives, joining the Senate, that's what happened this November. That's why we now have a gun sense majority in the House. And that's why they passed H.R. 8. We're now waiting on the Senate to bring it to a vote, and Mitch McConnell specifically. But we have seen that actually the public is mobilizing, that new lawmakers are mobilizing, that veteran lawmakers are mobilizing to enact common sense gun legislation. The Republican Party is clearly behind the times, which we can see again and again as our opponents consistently bring up the words of the founders to hide behind patriotic speech, as opposed to actually proposing effective solutions that reduce the epidemic of gun violence in this country. You're again and again bringing up the words and the actions of our founders, these white men who considered enslaved African Americans to count as 3/5 of a human. And you're saying that the exact terminology of their documents must now be abided by in every single case of the law, which we've seen Edmund Scalia refute, conservative icon in himself. But your line on the founders doesn't actually adapt to modern times, which is why I think this is an interesting question, because yes, we do have a system that limits, the tyranny of the majority, but we're seeing that the majority is mobilizing, that actions are being taken to promote the legislation that our side has again and again reinforced as legislation proven to reduce significant injury and death.
I may also weigh in.
We're going to stop it there because both sides have had the chance to respond to the question and we're over time. Anything the moderators want to say?
Yeah, we just want to say thank you everyone for coming, and thank you to SDR.
Thank you everybody for coming. If you want to talk with any of the participants up here or anybody sick, feel free to. We have voter registration tables outside, so if you feel passionate about this issue, register to vote. Yes.
Thank you.